the idea that Ukraine might join a Western military alliance would be quite unacceptable to any Russian leader. This goes back to 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed. There was a question as to what would happen with NATO. Gorbachev agreed to allow Germany to be unified and to join NATO. It's a pretty remarkable concession, with a quid pro quo that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase that was used.
So Russia has been provoked?
Well, what happened? NATO instantly moved to East Germany. Then Clinton came along, expanded NATO right to the borders of Russia. Now there are the new Ukrainian government, the government after the overthrow of the preceding one, the parliament voted, I think 300 to 8 or something like that, to move to join NATO.
Which you can understand why they would want to join NATO. You can see why Petro Poroshenko's government would probably see that it's protecting his country.
No, it's not protect. Crimea was taken away after the overthrow of the government, right? And he's not protecting Ukraine, is threatening Ukraine with major war. That's not protection. The point is, this is a serious strategic threat to Russia, which any Russian leader would have to react to. That's well understood.
As a historian, I would say that this conflict began 300 years ago, but we can't do that. As a contemporary observer, it certainly began in November 2013, when the European Union issued an ultimatum, really, to the then elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, that sign an agreement with us, but you can't have one with Russia too. In my mind, that precipitated this crisis. Because why give a country that has been profoundly divided for centuries, and certainly in recent decades, an ultimatum, an elected president, choose and divide your country further? So when we say today, Putin initiated this chaos, this danger of war, this confrontation, the answer is no. That narrative is wrong from the beginning. It was triggered by the European Union's unwise ultimatum.
I consider the administration's recommendation to take new members into NATO at this time misguided. If it should be approved by the United States Senate, it may well go down in history as the most profound strategic blunder made since the end of the Cold War. Far from improving the security of the United States, its allies, and the nations that wish to enter the alliance, it could well encourage a chain of events that could produce the most serious security threat to this nation since the Soviet Union collapsed. Ambassador Matlock's words. And Ambassador Jack Matlock joins us now.
And the reason I testified against it was that I saw that a process that we started then, if continued, and if continued up to the borders of the Soviet Union, to the borders of Russia, and included former parts of the Soviet Union that were recognized as part of the Soviet Union at that time, such as, most importantly, Ukraine and Georgia, that this would bring about a confrontation. And I would say my experience and the experience of others during the Cuban Missile Crisis brought home to us the dangers of a military confrontation between countries that have nuclear weapons. At the time, those of us involved, I was in Moscow at the American Embassy. Those involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 did not understand how close we came to a nuclear exchange. We learned that only later. But it would have been a disaster for both sides. And so I had hoped, and I advised that we not start this process of expanding NATO for that reason.
One thing that he said, which I consider to be unwise and possibly reckless, he went on to say that Russia wouldn't go to war with us because our conventional weapons are superior. That is an exceedingly provocative thing to say, and he seems to be unaware, President Obama, that Russian military doctrine says that when confronted by overwhelming conventional forces, we can use nuclear weapons. They mean tactical nuclear weapons.
The United States has the right, according to the United States, to intervene against any country that might threaten our alleged interests. That's United States policy. And under this doctrine, the United States has undermined and overthrown at least a dozen countries throughout Latin America, Central America, and the Caribbean. As many might recall, in 1962, we came to the brink of nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Now, why was that? Why did we almost come to the brink of nuclear war with the Soviet Union? Well, we did that in response to the placement of Soviet missiles in Cuba 90 miles from our shore. And the Kennedy administration saw that as an unacceptable threat to national security. We said it is unacceptable for a hostile country to have a significant military presence 90 miles away from our shore.
Why did I ask for a map of the United States and Mexico? Well, the United States has a pretty large border with Mexico. Now imagine that you have a revolution in Mexico. That's not that hard to imagine. And imagine that the government that comes to power is not a big fan of the United States of America. And I think that too is not difficult to imagine. But since it's a little bit afraid of Big Brother, it asks the Russians to send over 3 or 4 or 5 divisions to be placed on the U.S.-Mexican border. Think the U.S. would accept that? So why would the Russians accept this? That's what it's really all about. Does there have to be a compromise? In my opinion, yes. And the compromise has to be that Ukraine, guaranteed, will not become a member of NATO. And then the compromise is that the Russians get out.
Now a mob. It was no longer peaceful protesters, as it had been in November. It now becomes something else, controlled by very ultra-nationalist forces, overthrew Yanukovych, who fled to Russia, burned up the agreement. So who initiated the next stage of the crisis? It wasn't Russia. They wanted that agreement of February, a month ago, to hold, and they're still saying, why don't we go back to it? You can't go back to it. Though there is a report this morning that Yanukovych, who is in exile in Russia, may fly to eastern Ukraine today or tomorrow, which will be a whole new dimension. But the point of it is that Putin didn't want, and this is reality, this is not pro-Putin or pro-Washington, this is just a fact. Putin did not want this crisis, he didn't initiate it. But with Putin, once you get something like that, you get Mr. Pushback, and that's what you're now seeing. And the reality is, as even the Americans admit, he holds all the good options, we have none. That's not good policy making, is it?
What's going on here is that the West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path. And the end result is that Ukraine is going to get wrecked. And I believe that the policy that I'm advocating, which is neutralizing Ukraine and then building it up economically and getting it out of the competition between Russia on one side and NATO on the other side, is the best thing that could happen to the Ukrainians. What we're doing is encouraging the Ukrainians to play tough with the Russians. We're encouraging the Ukrainians to think that they will ultimately become part of the West, because we will ultimately defeat Putin and we will ultimately get our way. Time is on our side. And of course, the Ukrainians are playing along with this. And the Ukrainians are almost completely unwilling to compromise with the Russians, and instead want to pursue a hardline policy. Well, as I said to you before, if they do that, the end result is that their country is going to be wrecked. And what we're doing is, in effect, encouraging that outcome. I think it would make much more sense for us to work to create a neutral Ukraine. It would be in our interest to bury this crisis as quickly as possible. It certainly would be in Russia's interest to do so. And most importantly, it would be in Ukraine's interest to put an end to the crisis.
What Rasmussen said in your earlier clip, he's the political head of NATO, that we're building up as we talk our forces in Eastern Europe. Now understand what's going on here. When we took in, we meaning the United States and NATO, all these countries in Eastern Europe into NATO, we agreed with the Russians we would not put forward military installations there. We built some infrastructure, airstrips, there's some barracks, stuff like that. But we didn't station troops that could march toward Russia there. Now what NATO is saying, it is time to do that. Now, Russia already felt encircled by NATO member states on its borders. The Baltics are on its borders. If we move the forces, NATO forces, including American troops, toward Russia's borders, where will we be then? I mean, it's obviously going to militarize the situation and therefore raise the danger of war. And I think it's important to emphasize, though I regret saying this, Russia will not back off. This is existential. Too much has happened. Putin, and it's not just Putin. We seem to think Putin runs the whole of the universe. He has a political class. That political class has opinions. Public support is running overwhelmingly in favor of Russian policy. Putin will compromise at these negotiations, but he will not back off if confronted militarily. He will not.
Получает подачи в НАТО, то тогда мы можем говорить о каких-то сроках прекращения войны.
Нет, ни о каких сроках прекращения войны мы не будем говорить. Наоборот, это, скорее всего, подтолкнет крупные военные операции России против Украины. Потому что они должны нас будут просадить в инфраструктурном отношении и превратить здесь все в разваленную территорию для того, чтобы нас неохотно брали.
То есть Россия сможет пойти на прямую конфронтацию с НАТО?
Конечно. Нет, не НАТО. Они должны это сделать до того, как мы вступим в НАТО, чтобы мы не были интересны в НАТО. Перестали быть интересны, как разваленная территория. С вероятностью 99,9% наша цена за вступление в НАТО – это большая война с Россией. А если мы не вступим в НАТО, это поглощение России в течение 10-12 лет. Вот и вся вилка, в которой мы находимся. А теперь давайте выбирайте Зеленского.
Подождите, а теперь если поставить чашу на весу, а что лучше в таком случае?
Конечно, крупная война с Россией и переход в НАТО по результатам победы над Россией.
Что такое может быть крупная война с Россией?
Это воздушная операция наступательная, ввторжение российских армий, 4, которые они создали на наших границах, там, осада Киева, попытка окружить войска которые в АТО находятся, ВОЗ, в операции Объединенных сил, прорыв через Крымский перешейк, выход на Новокаховское водохранилище, чтобы воду в Крым дать. Наступление с территории Беларуси, там, создание новых народных республик, диверсии, удары по объектам критической инфраструктуры и так далее. Воздушно-десантный. Вот что такое полноценная война. И вероятность ее 99%.
Когда?
После 21-22 самые критические, 20-22 самые критические эти самые.